Hi everybody, this is Agnes from Sediment, and today we are going to rate wines not according to 100-point scale or 20-point scale, not even according to 5 stars or 3 glasses. We are going to rate wines based on their drinkability. And at the end, we'll put this idea to the test with a group of friends. Yes, in a way, it makes sense to have one standardized scoring system that is widely understood and gives us a shared sense of what is higher quality, what it might not be, and exactly how good a wine really is, point by point. But not only there is no single standardized scoring system, as we know quite well, more importantly, each of us scores wine differently. I have seen published scores from 2 very respected wine critics whose opinions I value highly with as much as 15-point difference. That might not mean much if both scores are on the lower end, but if one critic gives a wine 95 and the other gives it 80, the expected quality suggested by those scores is significantly different. This reveals not only how differently each of us thinks of quality and typicity in wine, but also most likely how sensitive each of us are to certain elements in wine. I am not as sensitive to Brett, so I might score a certain wine higher without really noticing it, while other critics could be very sensitive to it and score it lower or even give it a failing score and thus exclude it from a wine competition altogether. But as one of my dearest wine writers, Hugh Johnson, wrote in his book, Wine, A Life Uncorked, the weakness of any of these scoring systems is that it is based on wine tasting rather than wine drinking. We tend to dissect wines and talk about each of their elements separately. We talk about what is expected from a certain grape, region, quality level, or price category. We inevitably compare the wine with other wines in the lineup, or with wines from the same region or grape variety, and based on all of this, we score the wine giving it 90 points, 17.5 points, 7.75 points, or 2 bicchieri, often forgetting about the context of the wine and how it actually might be enjoyed. Forgetting the fact that it most likely will not be enjoyed in a well-lit, quiet environment lined up against other wines, but rather as part of the evening, with music in the background, chatter, and our dear friends and family around us. A wine might be scored highly based on its concentration and intensity, and that first sip might wow us. But sitting back and enjoying a full glass or 2, let alone finishing a bottle with your friends, might be rather difficult. It might not be the most drinkable wine.
As simple as it may sound, but the fine wine has to be super drinkable. I mean, if it's too intellectual, it requires, a master wine to understand it. Forget it.
I have always been a fan of Hugh Johnson's wine scoring system. The first bottle finished at the table, the wine we reached for to refill our glasses over and over again, is the best wine, no matter if it's scored 92 or 88. So today I'm going to judge wine based on its drinkability. Not only that, we are also going to experiment which wine bottle gets finished first in a group of wine friends. For me, it is Friday, after all. Before we go outside and test these wines with my wine friends in a real life setting environment, I will taste these wines myself, and I will talk about why they might or might not be highly drinkable wines. I have selected 3 wines that might be generally accepted as highly drinkable wines, and I have added 2 more which I think or I consider a highly drinkable wine styles. So the first one is super popular wine style, and it is commercially very successful globally, and that is none other than New Zealand's Sauvignon Blanc. And in this case, we are having Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc Marlborough 2023. Okay, so let's taste it. Of course, we are talking about highly intense aroma profile here. We have freshly cut grass, we have peaches and apricots, we have mango, we have passion fruit. I think it is universally loved wine style. Yes, I truly know that wine professionals sometimes sneer at this style, but I think it is super charming and it adds that freshness and liveliness. And one of the reasons why it is so super drinkable amongst general public as well, amongst general wine lovers as well, is because when you smell the nose, you can immediately recognize and name the flavors. And here in this wine, we have quite ripe fruit profile. Sometimes Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough can be quite green. That gooseberry and that liquidized asparagus-like flavors. This is not the case here. We even have some florals, some white blossom here. Let's taste it. This wine will also get drinkability points for the fact that it is light and juicy and fresh and crunchy style. It is so easy to enjoy, with variety of light snacks and foods. And also it is not heavy. It is not over bothering your palate. You can enjoy a glass or two without palate fatigue. Sometimes for more casual wine drinkers, the elevated, really high, crisp acidity might be too much here. It is one of the reasons why some Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc producers will leave some of the residual sugar at the end. It kind of covers the acidity. This one is completely dry and the acidity is really beautiful and I do enjoy this style. I think it is quite beautiful. I will give it quite high drinkability index. It might not be the first wine to be finished on the table because the next white wine is the one that I chose, but definitely it will be up there. Let's see the wine number 2, the wine that I chose, that I think, in my opinion, has high drinkability index. And you might know me by now, and that is Smaragd, Gruner Veltliner. In this case, it comes from Weinhofmeisterei Matthias Hirtzberger from a vineyard Greif. This is 2024 vintage, which was quite difficult vintage. It was rainy and cooler, so might not be the ripest of them all. However, Smaragd level requires harvesting grapes quite ripe. And of course, that ripe fruit-driven profile, it is always so inviting to both wine professionals, and more general public. I cannot imagine that this nose might not be seducing to everyone. It smells of ripe peaches, apricots, yellow plums. There is almost like thyme. It's like yellow plum and apricot jam with a bit of thyme in it. There's a bit of that earthiness. It just adds complexity to the wine. It is not simply fruit forward and fruit driven, wine. There is that edge that adds something to talk about, something to discuss about. Beautiful wine. We of course see that color-wise it is much deeper. We are talking about much riper grapes here. Let's taste it. Two completely different styles. When we talked about Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, from Marlborough, it was crispy, it was crunchy fruit style, it was acidity shaped style wine. And when we are talking about Gruner Veltliner, we are talking in this case about ripeness, about fruit generosity. We are talking about texture. Gruner Veltliner is a phenolic grape variety. It will almost always have that kind of phenolic grip, that phenolic element at the back. Some people are more sensitive towards it. I personally quite like it. I think it adds typicity to the grape. So maybe the fact that it has that phenolic finish, it might reduce slightly its drinkability index, if you will. But overall, I think that the fruit covers it beautifully. While I'm talking with you, my hand is reaching for another sip. I want to replenish those flavors and those tastes, on my palate. I will do so as well. Being such a young wine, I think it already offers a lot of drinkability. Let's move to the next three wines, which are going to be red. All right, with red wine, we're going to start with my choice because it is simply the lightest and the juiciest of them stylistically, and that is Gamay, Beaujolais, Beaujolais Cru. In this case, we are Chateau du Moulin-a-Vent, Camp du Cour, 2022 vintage. You might know my love for Beaujolais by now, not the Beaujolais Noir style, but more the Cru style. And recently, a book was released about Beaujolais Cru wines by Natasha Hughes, Master of Wine, by the way. And finally, we can study these wines a bit more, a bit deeper. You know, we can have knowledge of their history and knowledge of their stylistic differences. So let's stop talking and start tasting the wine. I do think that Gamay as a grape variety in general has high drinkability index. It is usually responsible for fresh and juicy and fruit-driven style wines. It does not have very high, grippy and firm and, intense type of tannin texture. It could be one of the reasons why we can drink 1 or 2 glasses easily, of Gamay. When I first smelled this wine, it was slightly reductive, but now that is evaporating and I have this really generous ripe cherry, black cherry character, blueberries and blackberries. Hints of smokiness, smoked cherry as well. But it's really plump, filled with juices. Like at the end of the summer when every bush and tree is giving you, their fruit. It like intense blueberries as well. I would want to think that this wine has a very high drinkability index. I mean, it is so lovely, and the first sip, it was so ripe. It was ripe fruit driven. Yes, when the fruit ended on the palate, we did feel a bit of structure from the tannin and we did feel a bit of, the warmth of the alcohol. But the fruit just gave such a lively texture and it filled the mid palate. I seriously think that this wine could be one of the winners. The acidity is quite elevated actually for Gamay here. It is lively and it just refreshes the otherwise really ripe fruit flavors. But let's move to the next 2 wines that we have here tonight. And the next is going to be, I think the grape in general also has quite high drinkability index, but it can be made in a very different, wide range of styles. Some might think that this wine that I chose might not necessarily be the most drinkable wine, but I think in general, because this wine is released quite ripe, quite developed already, it usually is one of the wines that people will finish first. And that is none other than Brunello di Montalcino, and the grape variety behind it is of course Sangiovese. And Sangiovese has quite high drinkability index, mostly because it has that really high juicy acidity, and acidity usually, it teases your buds. You kind of want to come back to the wine again and again and again, you have that mouth-watering sensation, and it definitely, tackles that point. As I told you, the wine is usually released quite mature, so the tannins are more rounded. Sangiovese can have quite harsh and high levels of really firm tannin texture, but here the tannins had time to, polymerize and create these bigger molecular chains. So on the palate, they feel softer somehow, they feel riper somehow. So of course, they're not really, attacking our palate, they're more just adding texture to the wine. But I've been talking a lot again. So let's taste and smell the wine. It smells so complex. Wow. It has that really, grown-up aroma, that mature character to it. It has all these flavors of red berries, ripe red berries, but they were not as jolly, as, energetic as with Moulin-a-Vent. Here, these fruit flavors are more calmed down, covered in these toasty elements of vanilla, some, herbs, balsamic and cedarwood. I mean, it is quite smoky wine, but the fruit definitely shines through. Brunellos can be quite different in their stylistic expression. This wine seems more, firm and well structured, with that really elevated acidity, which is part of the fruit, which is not playing, a separate game in the wine. This is really interesting. This producer, Pieve Restituta, it actually is part of the Gaja family, Gaja portfolio. So maybe I've made a mistake with choosing this wine because this is really firm. The tannin texture here in this wine is not as ripe, maybe not as soft as I expected originally. There are different Brunellos, and this is more style that you could calmly, easily put in your cellar and forget about it. We'll see how it goes with the group of my friends. Here I will say it is definitely towards the upper, level of drinkability. But let's move to the next wine. Next wine, which I personally don't think has quite high drinkability index, but whenever you talk with someone, it is usually one of the first wines to be mentioned. I used to work on the floor regularly, and I remember when there were table of two girls or table of two guys, and they would easily finish 2 bottles of this grape variety. It tends to develop quite high alcohol level, which would be one of the reasons why I think it does not have the highest drinkability index, but that is Primitivo. In this case, I chose a more premium Primitivo. I wanted to see how it acts in the setting, and I didn't want it to be the oddball out, choosing wine that maybe would be towards the entry level would actually jeopardize this kind of experiment. This one comes from Morella. It comes from old vines, so the grapes are harvested from really old vines, old vineyards. Salento. And the reason why I had such a deep breath is that it is 16% alcohol. Some of the reasons why Primitivo is often considered to have this really high drinkability index is because it has such a generous fruit on the nose and on the palate. Oftentimes it just tastes sweet even though there is no sugar. Sometimes there is some sugar left because, as I told you, it does develop really high sugar levels as it develops, and you kind of have to ferment it all into alcohol, or sometimes you can just leave a little bit. Not everyone prefers completely dry wines, so that would be one option. And that ripe, that generous fruit, that sweetness that we often see in certain Primitivo wines could be appealing to a wide range of people, making this wine sometimes in some settings one of the first wine to be finished. We'll see. But Morella is one of the top producers for Primitivo. And the first beautiful thing that we feel on the nose is definitely not the alcohol. We feel really ripe blackberries, black cassis, like really ripe wild strawberries, raspberries. There's also some spiciness to it, some kind of basil element towards it. I would say it's really complex wine. Wow.
Wow.
This is the first time I'm trying this wine, by the way. I haven't tasted this Primitivo. I do feel structurally the alcohol here in this wine. So it does cut short slightly the really fruity driven finish. It might not be for everyone the case. Some people are less sensitive towards alcohol. and I might be a bit more, but it's drinking quite nicely on the palate. And to a huge surprise for myself, the acidity is really high for this wine. Like, it is refreshing, it is juicy, it does not leave your palate, cloaking and sugary and sweet and tired. It refreshes, that full body of the wine, and it adds the freshness to the otherwise really ripe fruit profile. This is absolute beauty. Whether or not it has high drinkability index, that will be for my group of friends to decide. I think if they do not necessarily look at the labels and do not sneak peek the alcohol, they might finish this bottle amongst the first. It is really beautiful wine. And Primitivo, it does have elevated tannin texture, but it is always really ripe and soft, and it's like a cloud. It is not, punching your taste buds in any way. And that also adds to the drinkability index. I call it index a lot. Anyway, this is it. I've tasted all the wines. I know by now which I think might be the first ones to be finished, but we will discuss it later at the bar. Shall we leave? All right, now that I have excused myself to a more quiet place, we can start to talk about the conclusions of the evening. So, of course, the very first wine that we finished, I will leave it until the end, but the third wine that we finished was actually Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough Valley, 2023 vintage. It was quite interesting because at first a lot of people said that, this is the regular Sauvignon Blanc that we enjoy so much. We will choose other wines, but as I told you in the beginning, it will be towards the top of the drinkability index. So this was the third wine that we finished amongst all the wines. The second wine that we finished amongst all the wines was Moulin-a-Vent, Champ de Cour, 2022 vintage Moulin-a-Vent. So this is the Beaujolais cru that we talked about, and I think I told you that I thought that this wine would be quite high on the drinkability index, and it really was, and people did enjoy it, including myself. And the very first wine on the drinkability index, and I'm really happy to say that it was also my choice, was Weinhofmeisterei Mathias Hirtzberger Gruner Veltliner Smaragd 2024 vintage Greif. It was quite interesting about this wine because when we poured the wines for everyone, and everyone started to taste their wine and then to understand what is on the selection of the evening, a lot of people actually told that it is not their favorite wine, and they said, no, I don't want to continue with this wine. But somehow, when their glasses were empty, they came back to this wine and they wanted to refill their glasses. And I think, while we were traveling maybe to the venue and this wine gotten a bit warm, and, as it gets a bit colder, to the right serving temperature, and you realize how really beautiful and ripe and kind of exciting this wine is, then you are super excited about the style as well. So I'm super happy. This was the wine number one. So this is the highest drinkability index. So the Gruner Veltliner Smaragd Wachau to the rescue. Let me know in the comment section below what do you think of these wines and which wines would you score the highest in your drinkability index. And make sure to watch this video next.